the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I'm Vin Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And today, co-hosting again is my good friend and colleague, Erin McKimm, also in Melbourne. How you going, Erin?
I'm good, Vin. How are you? Good to be back.
Yeah, I'm fantastic, man. And this is actually a little bit of a change for us because usually we're up at the crack, around 5 a.m.
That's it.
And tonight we're actually doing this at about 10 p.m. And the reason being is that we have a special guest tonight who's also from Melbourne, Australia, who's a bit of a night owl. I don't think he really likes the early starts. And that is cTrix, a.k.a. Chris.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, Chris. Now, his job description, that's not correct.
My artist, I suppose, would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, your artist description is musician, developer, and promoter of music created on vintage hardware from the era of home computing and gaming technologies of the 80s and 90s. Now, that's something that I've kind of pieced together. So how is that kind of close to a reasonable job description for you?
Well, yeah. As my hobby and something I've done for many years is, been an avid interest, taken an avid interest in everything to do with, I guess, the early computers, the Commodore and the things like the Atari 2600 and these simple machines that were, designed for playing games, but they're actually got quite interesting synthesizers in them, and they've got limiting synths in them as well, which is very fun. Right.
So, that's what's always intrigued me, that we go back at least, it would have to be at least 10 years, I'd say, Chris. We've known each other for at least 10 years. And you did come to me for a computer solution, but interestingly, not primarily for audio production. It was more so for video and graphic editing, which is not my main shtick, so to speak, but I do limited numbers of video and graphic editing machines for select clients. So you came to me for that, and I do remember, when we first met, that you were giving me an overview of what you were doing. So all I saw was a whole stack of these, gaming consoles. I just couldn't get my head around it, So can you give us an overview of exactly what it is? Now, I mean, the whole genre, or is it, we'll call it a genre.
It's not really a genre, it's a platform.
It's a platform. That's what I was about to say. It's not really a genre. And it goes under a couple of names, chip tunes, chip music. So do you want to give us a bit of an overview of how you actually got into it and why it is something that you choose to continue doing over, what the majority of people are doing, obviously, in regards to the way they're creating music with computers nowadays, where
Sure.
computers for you are more a secondary thing, more as a delivery medium, where your whole creative output is actually based around these earlier technologies. So that'd be great if you can give us, a bit of a 101 of how you landed in this space.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess as a kid, I actually started writing music when I was very, very little on the Commodore 64. And, when I was three and a half, we had, I was very lucky to get a computer in the house. And my folks could see the importance of computers. They'd both learnt how to program with punch cards in the 80s. And my grandmother was a sort of big piano player and sort of big into the music thing. And my first word was music as a kid. So I think my folks figured out that I liked music. So they put the two together and got a piece of Commodore 64 music composing software. which I'm actually about to do a YouTube video on. I managed to find a box copy of it recently.
Oh, really?
So I'm going to install it on a real machine and actually try to make a track with it many moons on. But that was, I don't know, my first brush with the synthesizer and these weird ADSR things and LPF and HPF, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I just mashed all these buttons as a 3 or 4 year old, and to me that was much more fun than playing games. It was just this really fun, wild time putting colored dots on the screen. It was like an early piano roll style thing as well, and playing with these all these parameters up and down and make the computer make silly sounds. So, I guess that was my first brush with something that predates VSTs by 20 years, but I was there playing with it as a kid and just loved it. So for me, that it was always that super simplistic thing of having everything on one screen and just playing around and making sounds. And I guess growing up, I kept doing that as I moved platforms. So on the Amiga, you'd have these super short samples that you could load in and you could start making music with them, and you had little generator programs that would generate simple waveforms, even with a command prompt kind of thing. And then moving across to the PC and stuff. But I mean, there was a whole period then when I got a 4-track, and then I started playing drums and guitar and bass and just recorded metal for like many, many years. But I came back to it when I was at uni, and I just found everything got a bit complicated on the PC, and it just didn't have the same vibe as keeping it simple and keeping it fun. So I guess I've always had that sort of philosophy at the center of my heart. And especially with the tracker-based music, which was sort of top-down. For electronic music anyway, I just found it was really easy to cut things around. And we will talk about, I guess, trackers in a sec. But I just found this approach in music when I was very young. I guess I was about maybe 8 to 12 or 13 when I really hit going back into techno.
Yep. And what year was that, roughly, just to kind of put a time stamp on it?
Commodore 64 would have been 84, 85.
Yeah.
And then the Amiga would have been 80, would have been a bit later after that, actually, about 1990 to 1993.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because those early computer platforms for me started off with the Atari. And purely, the Atari was just purely used for sequencing.
MIDI.
Yeah, but for MIDI
I've got
sequencing.
one next to me. I've got a ST1024 sitting at the other end of my room.
Yeah. So I had a 1040. I had a 1040 STE, and I also had a Mega.
Just the 1040. Yes.
I had a Mega 4 as well, which had a massive, I think, 100 megabyte hard drive. So just don't get too excited there. But it had a 100 megabyte hard drive on it, and 4 megabyte of RAM. And
that would have been well into the 90s at that point.
That would have been, 93 to 95 was the Mega. 93 to 95 was the Mega 4. 1040 was, I had the 1040 from about 89 on. Yeah, 89 on.
Yeah.
And look, interestingly, it is interesting that you started on the Commodore, because what triggered this whole idea to get you on was the last show that I did with Pete Brown. He was reminiscing about how he first got into the electronic music, and it just happened to be he was at school playing around with a Commodore computer, and he was more intrigued in the intro music than the actual games,
Yes.
So, how was this actually generated? So I do have a quick question, because this stuff has always intrigued me. That what was because I'm really big into the whole synthesis side of things, and back in the 80s I had all my Jupiter 8s and analog gear. Is what was the actual sound generation mechanism on those, or not mechanism? What was the actual sound generation on those early computers and consoles? So, look, I was chatting to Erin earlier this week as we were preparing for the show, and I'm thinking, was it FM? What was it? Samples? Was it a DCO? I just have no idea. So this is something that you can actually enlighten us on now, if you can.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, it depended to begin with what you were using. They were all different, and that's why they're interesting.
Right.
Each sort of machine is interesting. If you're talking Commodore 64, it used something called the SID chip,
Yep.
which was a 3-channel, basically had 3 DCOs, and you could do a sort of a slightly fuzzy triangle wave, you could do a sawtooth wave, and you could do, it actually had a sine, but it was pretty wobbly as well, and then you could do square as well, and you had that over 3 channels. You also had a noise, a sort of quasi noise. It was sort of like a repetitive noise, but you could use that for snares and for hi-hats and things like that. Then it had an ADSR. Well, it actually didn't have a full ADSR. It was a attack and release, I think it was, and a sustain, an AS and an R for each of those 3 channels. So you would think, but by itself, that would be, that's basically the beginnings of a synth. But then, much like a poly, it also had a single low-pass filter, which you could choose between low-pass, high-pass, or band-pass. So, and that applied to all of the notes, but the actual notes themselves could be a combination of things. So you could have a sine wave, and you could have a noise, and you could have a triangle wave, all running together. But then all of those went to the pass filter. But you could choose if the pass filter filtered all of them together, or just one of the sounds, or 2 of the sounds. So you could sort of map where they ended up.
Okay, and I was those filters.
Yes.
Did it have any resonance? Was it a resonant filter?
Yes, they did have a resonance. Yes, and they sounded different in every single Commodore. So this weekend we're running the Australian chip music competitions, and I've actually got a bunch of Commodores. I've just blown the dust off, and we've got different revisions of the chips. We've got some that are a bit more squelchy than others, depending on their revision.
Right.
And because they actually had an external filter that the audio went out of the chip and then back in for the filter.
Okay, and these are all digital components, though, right? They're not. There's no analog filters.
Well, no, the filter is actually an analog filter. It actually goes outside of the computer for part of the filter anyway, and then back in. They've sort of got this like a cap and a resistor and a couple of other things that sort of it takes a little round trip out of the chip and then back in again. Right.
Okay. So we had a full analog resonant filter on those early chips.
On some of them.
Kind of like the Ensoniq SQ1. I've got one of those, and it's got a analog filter as a synth, but it's all kind of digital wavetable.
Yes, I had one of those as well.
Yeah, but the filter on that's really nice because it's analog.
Yeah.
And if you think about doing digital filtering, it's really something you emulate, and that's you're talking like fast Fourier transforms and push and maths. It gets very complicated quite quickly. So yes, you could do it in a sampler, like where you've got dedicated DSP for it, but on a games console that's designed for cheap, it's like quite hard. Like a filtering isn't that expensive to build the circuit. It's actually all of the stuff called buffering on the input and the output. So you like your pre's and your sort of post electronics that are quite expensive. But the actual filter side is, I mean, you get multiple poles and stuff and it gets a bit crazy, but that's not too expensive. So, but doing it digitally and emulating a filter, like there is no such thing as a digital filter. You're doing it with emulating. You're basically emulating, to some degree, analog electronics.
Yeah.
That's a bit controversial.
Yeah.
One other question, Chris. So you were talking about the sequencing of it, how you could kind of choose where the filter would land on those 3 channels. So it's kind of like a parameter lock scenario where like each step you can change what it's landing on.
Yeah.
Kind of like at that molecular level that you do with a tracker kind of vibe. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the fun of it. But you would get some clicks and some weird sounds as you click them on and off. They're not smooth and fluid like you would expect. So especially if you switch between a high pass filter and a low pass filter, depending where the oscillator is at the time, it's going to give you a pop.
Yep.
And even when you turn the volume up and down, you get a click as well. If you've got like a sine wave and it's, for instance, it's at low, when you turn the volume, it'll actually click.
Right. But that's all part of the vibe, yeah?
Well, it is all part of the vibe. And in fact, that click that you get from changing the volume, because you can change the volume very quickly, but the oscillators are consistent. But if you actually just set an DC offset and then you change the volume and you do it quick enough, you can actually do digital sample playback because the CPU can do it really quick. So you can actually modulate samples into waveforms and stuff by using your computer, your CPU power to actually play back digital samples and stuff.
Yeah, right.
So that's a complete hack. Like nobody knew the Commodore could play samples until one day it did, and they were like, "How the hell did someone do that?"
What happened there?
Wow.
Yeah, and now there's all sorts of clever stuff happening. But you'll find a lot of the time there's real weird digital artifacts that are happening because you're carrying your digital signal on top of a waveform effectively. But you can add the two together and you can do some real wild new sounds. That's the thing. Like, people have kept exploring the Commodore 64.
Yeah, so it's those limitations that become part of the sound palette, and all the little tricks and all the little sounds you can create with it is like just messing with, we'll change a high pass to a low pass at this point with this particular oscillator, you get this sound. So I guess you'd be kind of working those into your compositions and tracks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing with the chip music thing is actually, what have I got to work with? And a lot of the time you'll just come up with a crazy sound and you'll be like, oh, I like that sound. I'm going to do something with it. And then that'll be the basis of your whole track. So,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So apart from the Commodore, and this that was one of these computers that completely slipped under my radar. You're using is it Game Boys, and there's a lot of the little gaming consoles. Chris, can you actually explain? Well, actually, just give us an idea of some of those gaming consoles that you're actually using as well.
Yeah, sure. And I'll brush over them quickly. But something like the Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis, if you're from America, has a FM chip in it.
So there are some with FM chips. There you go.
Yamaha FM chips.
Yep.
But they've got things like 7-bit outputs, so they're a bit more fuzzy. They're a little bit crunched down. Yamaha kind of didn't want it to be as high quality as the DX, obviously.
Wow, high quality as the DX. Yeah, there's a bit of an oxymoron. Yes,
they still hissed as much.
Yeah.
But yeah, like there's basically that's 4-op FM, and there's 6 channels worth of 4-op, and then a channel which you can switch to digi. So that's quite fun.
So that was complete FM. There was no filtering or ADSR or anything like that. That was actually essentially a tiny, a small 4-op FM synth, like some of the smaller Yamaha. Offerings.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay.
I've lost my icon for it on my desktop. I was going to bring it up in front of me so I could double check. But that's the typical, you do have like ADSR and stuff, but it's like, it depends where you put it in the chain of FM.
Right.
There's like attack and release. And if you put it as the last thing, it'll obviously change the volume. If you put it up top, it'll change the timbre. And so it's the same programmability as a DX7, but only with 4 things running into each other.
My only FM synth is a TG77. Let me tell you, I mean, the FM side of it, I don't really touch, apart from some of the sound generation stuff, but I don't dive into the FM side of it. It's got a really powerful FM engine. And the thing with the TG77 is it had an FM engine and it had a PCM based engine.
That's right.
With a resonant filter and the usual ADSRs. And so I lived in that side of it more than anything else because I could never get my head around FM, But
it takes a little bit, yeah. FM is sort of one of those sciences, I guess. If you slow it all down, it all makes a lot more sense. I found I didn't understand it till years later.
Yeah, well,
but,
that's the same with, I don't know if you've sat in front of the Kurzweil Vast system. Just, I'm trying to remember who I was having a discussion about, just how powerful that was. But that did my head in as well, trying to get my head around that whole Vast engine that they had back in the day. And it was, way ahead of its time. But I don't know if you dove into the Vast side of stuff at all, Chris.
No, I never did. Erin, what about yourself? Did you ever get into the FM side?
Not really. I'm probably more of a subtractive synthesis kind of person, but look, I use a lot of samples. But look, I have played with FM8 and I do a bit of FM in Serum, so it's all just software based, but never actually hardware FM.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
Yeah, so pretty basic. It's fun. You can get some pretty cool sounds like that you obviously can't get otherwise. Some really crunchy stuff, which I like.
And there's some sort of semi-undocumented stuff as well on these, which didn't quite work properly, where Yamaha sort of half worked on something and then left it open because it was just doing weird stuff.
Yeah.
And you can program sounds up into that and start getting some wild out of control sounds. Super fun.
Yeah, I got a mate. He's like a pretty crazy synthesis guru, and he does a lot of FM stuff, and some of the sounds he gets, I'm just like, whoa, this blows my mind. How'd you do that? But he kind of works it all out before he does it as well. So it is a science, I reckon, definitely.
Yeah.
So sorry, guys, we got sidetracked, Chris. I sidetracked you on the FM. So where were we? Oh, we were talking about the consoles.
At all the different systems.
Yeah, we were talking about the consoles. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Oh, I love the Mega Drive. I should have put at the end.
Oh, Mega Drive.
That is the FM crazy box. But
right.
yeah, there's the Mega Drive has a crazy FM Yamaha chip in it. You've got the Nintendo, the original NES, which has a what does it have? 2 channels of pulse wave. It has a triangle wave, a noise, and a really fuzzy digital PCM, but it's really weird.
All right.
It's called Delta PCM.
So no saw waves on that one?
No, not by default.
Right.
And then there's the Game Boy, which again is similar to the original NES. It has 2 pulse wave channels. It has what we call a wave channel, but it's 4-bit wave with 256 sample length. I think it is samples, so they're really crunchy. And then we have a noise channel on that as well. You have things like the Master System or the Atari. You were talking about the Atari ST. That has just a simple 3 square wave chip in it. Can't really do much. It does have something called hard reset that does some interesting effects at full volume. So that's, that's obviously most people use it for MIDI, but it could make sound as well. Then you've got the later machines like the Super Nintendo, which had a 8-channel sampler on it.
Oh, right.
But it had no memory. It had 64K of RAM. So you had to fit your samples and your tune in 64K and your sound effects for your game. So it was very much a wave table-y sort of thing, short wave table, but people pushed it. And then you had your Amiga, which was a bit of a revolution. That had, it was 1985 really when that came out, and that had a 4-channel 8 bits on each output. So it was sort of added up to, I guess, 12 bits, you could say, and independent volume controls on each one, independent playback of speeds and all sorts of stuff. And it could do it all out of like this special chip. So it took 0 CPU to play back a pretty complex track. And that you could use all your RAM if you wanted. So you could put up to a meg, 2 meg, 4 meg worth of samples in and stream them out. Which was pretty revolutionary. And then, there was, it just kept going from there. There was things like the Sega Saturn, which had its own crazy Yamaha chip in it. Sega really had a big relationship with Yamaha, where the Sony had a relationship with Nintendo.
Right.
So, it was interesting. Everybody had a different take on what they were creating. And I guess we're trying to create something a bit different to have a different sound to each other and exploit different cheap ways of doing things. But the Japanese, were pretty crazy. They would actually add additional sound chips in their cartridges. So the Famicom, which was with a Nintendo in Japan, you would buy a cartridge and it came with extra synthesis built into the cartridge.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's interesting.
So it was a synth expander.
Yeah, exactly. And you'd get different things. So you were saying before about does the Nintendo have like, a saw wave? Well, it actually did with some of the expanders. They would give you an extra couple of channels or 3 channels in some cases. There were different sort of variants of chipsets people developed for different. So it had a line in which fed back in. But the Western computers didn't have that line in for some reason. So we got the Nintendo Entertainment System, which is a bit more budget, and Japan got the Famicom, which was a little bit more, future thinking and had that loop back in. So it could expand.
Now, the other question I have for you is that you don't only generate sound with these consoles, you actually sequence on them as well. So how does that come about? I mean, they didn't have sequences on these consoles, did they? Or is this
not
something
all of
that's...
them, but so something like a Game Boy, there's a program called LSDJ, and that's a little cartridge that plugs in your Game Boy, and you write the music by going up, down, left, right. Holding a B button would set a note. That would add a note so that you've got octave up and down and note up and down. And then you just basically scroll up and down and do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
Oh, like a step sequence.
Step sequence,
yeah.
And it's you get pretty used to it to the point where you can knock out a track in 5 or 6 hours. And and then you've got a 4-part sequencer. So you do, it's a bit like programming a 303. You've got your 16 sequence 16 note sequences that you then, or patterns, 16 note patterns that then drop into a sequencer that then drop into a bigger sequencer. So you've got like multiple layers of subsequences, And then, you build your track out of that. And you can do things like ends early so that you get cool timing things. And it's quite fun. And there's a live mode as well. So you can actually mute and you can jump to different positions, a bit like Ableton, but with 4 channels. And you can mute and change octaves and keys. And so that's for the Game Boy. But it's actually a full DAW that fits on a cartridge in your pocket, effectively.
Right. That's amazing.
Awesome.
And I have seen some of your live performance videos at some of those massive festivals. That kind of just blew me away, the size of some of the crowds at those festivals. So your live performances mix the consoles, and sometimes you have sometimes you always have multiple up there. I think I was watching one video. I think you had I think it was 8 consoles synced together, and then you were comping live over the top with a synth, which I thought was great. I can't remember the exact performance. You probably remember which one it was. I think you were doing a cover.
Yeah, quite possibly. I was doing a cover. One of them was a cover of one of my friend's tracks. I do a lot of covers of things like VHS idents and stuff, where you have these like kind of really cool little 80s ditties at the start or something, but I'll turn it into a whole track. I mean, like the old KPM audio stuff. But that's on the Amiga, so I'll often use that as the sort of bass, because you can do that's sort of like a lo-fi, 8-bit sort of like a super lo-fi module. So it's still digital audio, but that's fun to play along with. And I've also got the Game Boy, is one I use a bit on stage, because it's so fun and easy, and you can jump around with it on the end of an extension cable.
Yeah. And you also have this thing that you call hang on, I've got to get the pronunciation right here. The Guitari, which is spelt little g and then capital A, for Atari. Guitari. Do you want to describe what that is for the people listening in, if they haven't actually experienced?
It's very silly. It's basically a Atari 2600, which was the very first gaming console that sort of had capability in terms of cartridge system. I mean, there were others, but it was one of the main ones that upped its ante and became popular. And it's the Atari 2600 from 1977. And in order to play on it, there's not much memory, and so you end up with a lot of loops and a lot of really simple stuff. And I ended with that, and I had a joystick for switching parts, and I can only really switch between 2 or 3 parts. And then I had a delay pedal for doing sort of like cool, when you hit the delay pedal and you turn the time down and it goes and things like that.
Yeah.
So I had that, and then I needed an EQ pedal because the signal out of it was really hot and I needed to duck it down. And so I had all these pedals and all these bits in front of me, and I was like, oh God, this is going to be impossible to take to a show, because you're always considering how long it takes to set up on stage. Even now, with the Ableton people, if you play hardware, you're like, oh, I've got to get my Electron out, I've got to get my synth, and I've got to do, and you're calculating what the swap over time is for setup. So I just thought, well, I'll mount it all on a board. And then I was like, no, hang on, I may as well chuck a strap on it and mount it to a sort of starlight, mount all the pedals and all the joysticks, all the bits to sort of neck, and just like screw the Atari on it. It's got a couple of holes in the back of it anyway. And so, I did that, and it became the Guitari. So it's basically, I've got all my pedals and everything on a neck, and then a joystick as a sort of guitar neck. So that's why I did it. It was just practical and kept everything together.
Yeah. Oh, and look, and it's visually
cool.
It looks fantastic with you, comping away on stage with that thing. So that's awesome. Erin, do you have any questions for Chris with regards to the consoles and the technology?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so with your Amiga setup, do you use Octamed for that? Or do you use something else?
Not yet. I've been looking at going into it. I use ProTracker.
Okay.
Which was pre-Octamed. I could use Octamed, but I would only use it in 4-channel mode. And I would use it for its MIDI capability as well, but I just find that ProTracker is really fun, and a lot supports it. There's lots of trackers that will take a mod file and you can do things with. So
yeah, cool.
Yeah, but there were 2 camps. It kept going. Octamed became a thing that if you had a fast enough Amiga and you needed the more expensive expanders and things that cost thousands of dollars, you could run more than 4 channels. You could do 8 channels of digital audio, and it down mixed it to I think it was 14-bit. So but it did all of that in CPU instead of hardware.
Yep.
And a lot of people sort of swore by it, and you could do MIDI and control the MIDI, much like a Atari, I guess, but it was just way more tracker focused. So a lot of people use it for drum and bass and things like that.
Yeah, that's where I've heard it, because I come from a jungle drum and bass background. That's kind of what I cut my teeth on back in the 90s. When I first started with electronic music, I was playing around with Scream Tracker.
Yep.
I used to have to load up DOS to actually run it.
Yeah.
And just, cut out breakbeats and stuff like that. But I saw a guy, would have been last year or the year before, Paradox. He's a drum and bass guy, and he actually plays live with Octamed.
Yeah.
And he played down in Melbourne at Grumpy's, and he had it set up and he like flipped it around. It was just interesting seeing like a tracker playing live on a big sound system.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, I've got other friends that write jungle, predominantly kind of the more, drum funk or breakbeat bass stuff with lots of edits, and they love using trackers for all that kind of stuff. So I was just interested kind of where the different worlds meet in a way.
Yeah, well, and I guess that's the thing with trackers. You've nailed it, because it's, for those of people out there who haven't seen a tracker, we're talking about music composition like an Excel spreadsheet where it steps down the steps. It's like a event list in MIDI, except it's locked. You have that vertical down. It's a little bit, if you've got an electron, it'll be the same thing. It's as it counts left to right, a certain amount of things can happen on that one strike. And you can tweak every single element of everything within a single patch.
Yeah,
so if you've got a filter,
yeah,
that's going, you can program that in, and you can easily copy and paste slabs and variations and offsets and do syncopated, really cool stuff really easy. And that's where the drum and bass stuff, but where you have to be really tight with your timing and consideration. It just works super well with that top-down sequence. It's a little bit like seeing a step sequence just, rotating in front of you.
So would it be similar to the original notator on the Atari? Did you ever see that, Chris? This is pre-Logic. So notator became Creator and then became Logic.
Is it top down or is it?
It was top down. Yeah, right? It was.
Okay.
So there was the two main sequences on the Ataris back in the day. There was the notator and Cubase. Now Cubase has got, as you know, the traditional left to right arrange window that we all use now. That started back in the old Cubase, the Atari Cubase, where notator was completely different. It was this top down sequence of stuff, and I'm looking at it going, I couldn't get my head around it, especially coming from that Cubase environment where everything was just directly in front of me, everything was flowing from left to right, where notator was just basically a top-down list of things.
It's funny though, it's like people that use trackers predominantly, they feel the other way. But music should go top down.
Yeah, but that's why I've made the point. So when just listening in on the description, I'm going, hang on, that sounds identical to what the old notator was. Yeah,
but it's a different set of dimensions, because piano roll is very inefficient. Like as a dimensional composer, you've got it's like a graph where you've got top to bottom and left to right, where the dots are moving up and down, and then they're not. The dots are on the screen, but what do the dots mean? The dots don't matter. They're just dots. I mean, now they're colored and we use them for velocity and stuff. It's a bit different. But, back in the day, having a tracker, rather than just one instrument at a time on each piano roll, because that's the thing, you have to jump in and out of each piano roll to get to your different instruments, or you used to have to until recently, whether a tracker had a single column and had your notes values in them. So you'd have room for 8, even now I can do 20 columns on my screen, and I've got every single part of every instrument playing at the same time. So if I want to, do a top-down view of my track, I'm always got that in front of me. I've always got every single instrument playing and all the parts of every instrument. So if I go, I really feel like this needs turning down here or this element needs happening here, I can jump instantly to any track of any part of the song and tweak it. I don't have to bury into my master track, my sequencer and double click on the part and bring that part up. Like that just sounds alien to me. Like if I don't have the entire song at all times in front of me, how am I supposed to easily quickly try things and go, oh, no, that didn't work, undo. It's a very different way, and you can just copy and paste whole slabs of every single instrument very quickly, and then offset them and juggle them around. And whether a lot of that stuff would take ages if you were doing it.
Yeah.
It's also that thing of you're using a QWERTY keyboard as well. So, you're not necessarily sitting there with a MIDI keyboard and playing stuff in. Like I've seen people that are very proficient and they can move very quickly and they can, write stuff extremely fast with a QWERTY keyboard and kind of get the samples in tune and all that kind of stuff.
It's a very different way of working, having everything in front of you, an event, just a massive chunky events list of everything. But it does limit you as well. Like, of course, the beauty of piano roll is that you've got your pixel values, especially now with high-res screens, is you can nudge stuff backwards and forwards and micro time. Yeah. Whether having to micro time with a tracker, you're locked in a lot more. Which if you're doing drum and bass and jungle, I mean, you want to be locked in anyway. But I guess you don't have that fluidness. It's very rigid.
There's a way they get around that with the grooves, like kind of the internal grooves of the breakbeat. So they'll actually chop up the individual bits, but they'll also chop up bits like parts of the breakbeat. So you actually, it might be a kick to a snare and then a snare to a kick or whatever. And then they can actually trigger those little sequences and they keep the kind of that natural groove that was in the breakbeat and chop it around like that. So there's kind of little tricks that some people use to maintain that groove rather than having it exact on the grid as well.
Yeah.
You can kind of do both. But yeah, I've always been fascinated with this whole kind of concept of parameter locks. And I'm saying that because I have like an octatrack myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of concept that each note can just have all your parameters just locked exactly to that note, even switching out samples or switching out sounds and having it on the same kind of note of the sequencer. It's just a very different way of kind of thinking. It's kind of it seems much more molecular than, with your kind of traditional DAW setup where, you've got your individual tracks or, your individual notes that trigger certain sounds. It's kind of like you can get right in there and get it exact per note. Do you find is that part of something that draws you to it, or?
It is, and it shapes the sound. Because I'm even thinking now, like with techno, where you're sort of doing a little loop of like, and you're switching between different samples really quickly.
Yeah.
Quick flipping between samples is just, and offsets is just something I do all the time. I don't even think about. If it would be hard with a piano roll, I wouldn't try it in a piano roll. Well, I would, but I'd do it with waveform. I'd cut it up with waveforms and I'd juggle it.
And that's how I've got around it, like using kind of your more traditional DAW. I've always used audio for all my kind of beat-based stuff because of that exact thing. It's like you've just got a lot more control rather than having, a sample on each track and, C3 triggers a kick drum or something like that. It's very limiting. And say you want, certain effects, certain EQ, distortions, whatever, sound shaping stuff on that one kick of that one moment in the track. It's kind of really clumsy to try and automate that and get that exact control.
And you find yourself, I don't know if you do this too, but if you're a Reaper user, maybe, I find I write tracks in Reaper where I just use waveform. And per note, you press Shift and E to get the effect.
Oh, totally, yeah.
And I'm constantly just
clip-based effects.
Yeah, I got heaps of tracks that are just like, for a second you drop into an effect, and it's all a lot on one line. I never really use more than 8 or 10 tracks in Reaper either when I'm writing music because I'm adding multiple things on one track.
Yeah.
And swapping between different samples and different things. And a lot of people are like, whoa, this is like a head screw. You've got like 5 different bass sounds here. And then you've got a vocal sample where the bass should be. I was like, well, it kind of matched the EQ. And I just sort of counteracted the EQ with a effect at the time. And it's like, I color code stuff. But
I think that's something really powerful about Reaper. That you can do that. And something else I love about Reaper is that you can actually kind of vary speed samples musically by semitones and synths. So it's
just
kind
with that
of like
alt and stretch thing.
Exactly. Well, I've got them on like hotkeys on my. I've got a gaming keyboard. I've got like macros. So basically, I can get any sample and just pitch it vary speed. So like you would in a tracker or you would in a sampler, you can just slow it up, speed it down, but musically. So you can kind of work with audio at that level, whereas there's not. I mean, Ableton can do it, but it's not kind of as just kind of smooth and easy as it is in Reaper, because Reaper's great for for audio in that sense, I reckon.
So, interestingly, I have got Reaper down a little bit further down the list, guys. So we can actually come back to Reaper.
Jumping ahead.
But just real quickly, and this will lead us back to Reaper, Chris. Obviously, you're doing the majority of your creative stuff is on the consoles. But
no, it's 50-50 actually.
Okay, so that's the question I was about to ask you. So there is still a computer component to it, but not so much in regards to VSTs. You don't really use VSTs that much, if at all.
Not
Is that
for
correct?
chip stuff, no. If it's a synthesis, I don't really have much interest in.
Right.
If it's something that I can do with a piece of hardware easily and cheaply, I'll do it with a piece of hardware.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there's nothing quite like having a synth in front of you and tweaking. Like my little micro brute, I use that on heaps of
How
stuff.
good are they? I'm
They're
borrowing
amazing.
one at the moment.
So you don't really get into the analog model virtual instruments at all? No?
No.
Okay. I mean, there are some quite good ones, out
I
there.
do. Look, and I have 4 VST eyes on my computer, and
Oh, right.
that's it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they are Keyscape that does piano
Yes.
and synths, and because that's beautiful, it's just
It is
gorgeous. You
very
see, I
nice,
can't
yeah.
afford those instruments. I can't have a grand piano. I can't afford a LA one like Rhodes. And then I've got Drummix, which is drums and sounds super natural. And again, I've got a controller, a Roland thing, but miking up a kit is a pain in the ass.
And sorry, what was that? What was that
It's
drum?
called
virtual?
Drummix.
Drummix.
Yeah, it's a very kind of natural sounding. The drum kits are all a bit beaten up and a bit kind of, and they're all recorded with like 8 or 10 mics, and you can actually mix it as if it's so it's quite a raw.
It's not
thing.
one that I'm familiar with. So
No, it's
so
very
these are acoustic drums, or are we talking electronic?
Acoustic.
Acoustic drums.
So all
Okay.
my
Check that out.
VST stuff
Sounds cool.
is acoustic instruments basically, and then I've got the Trillium, which is the bass stuff,
Yes.
which is pretty good,
Yeah.
and then Omnisphere just for its sample library.
So you're a
'Cause it's-
Spectrasonics fan.
I'm a Spectrasonics.
Yeah.
I've bought all their products, and that's all I have: Spectrasonics and Drummix. And
now,
that's
what was the one before Omnisphere? What was it called?
Keyscape.
No.
it. Oh, you're thinking
Atmosphere.
Atmosphere.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first fired up Atmosphere, I'm hearing JD800 and JD990 all over that thing.
Yeah.
Because Eric Persing was a key programmer over at Roland for many
Yes,
years. He
many
was heavily
years.
involved with all of the D50 and the JDs and all the rest of it. So, but the signature sounds, when I first heard it, because I've got the JDs here, I got the big smile on the face going, I think I know where he's pulled a couple of those sounds from.
Oh, yeah.
So, but yeah, the Spectrasonic stuff is fantastic. So that doesn't overly surprise me that if you are going to be using VSTs that are not going to be intrinsic to the sound that you're doing with the trackers, that's where you're going to be heading.
Well, it's the beautiful thing of emulating something so well. It's like you've got all this computing power. You may as well, rather than trying to emulate something that's a wobbly piece of electronics. I mean, the only electronics wobbles like like it does.
Like
it's
an
weird.
analog
I don't know.
synth,
I
yeah.
can't be fooled by it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I just find that the pianos and especially and the Rhodes sounds, it's just like it's like you're playing the real thing. It boggles me.
So you don't get into any of the orchestral libraries at all?
Not yet.
No.
I like to buy my libraries, and it's quite expensive to get.
It's a
good
rabbit
libraries.
hole.
Yeah, it is a bit of a rabbit hole, but I can help you with that one, Chris, if you need to.
Yeah,
I've
I'm
got a
curious
stack of libraries available, so
I'd be curious to come and have a listen and a preview and see if there's one I gel with.
Yeah.
Because I have actually just picked up a film which I'm writing music for, or a documentary, and I've got to do a bunch of 70s disco and.
Oh, that sounds cool.
The Omnisphere has some stuff, but I really need a 70s disco string pack.
So is there?
At the moment.
Does Keyscape have does it have acoustic pianos as well, or is
Yeah,
it just
it does.
it does have acoustic pianos
Yeah.
as well? Yeah. Okay.
And I got onto it because one of my favorite jazz artists, Anomaly, was doing all this crazy hip hop piano crossover stuff, and I was like, God, that piano sounds gorgeous.
What is it?
And then I was like, oh, it's not real. And he's doing all this classical runs and all this stuff. It's like, that's beautiful. Like, what a grand sound. And I got completely fooled. And that to me is like, the beauty of a good VST. You see, that's what the spirit of a VST was always for me, was taking something that was an acoustic instrument and making it real, rather than the emulation of electronics, which is cool still. And there's even things for chip music and things that emulate the chips and try to make them sound natural, but they don't add the hiss and they don't add all the rest of the.
Well, they're too clean,
stuff. Yeah, that's it.
They're too clean. But the orchestral stuff is just the advancements in that is what's fascinated me, because it's actually grown with the computer technologies, and
the amount of hard drive space you've got.
Yes,
and fast hard drives
and SSDs. Yes, how fast they can actually stream that attack portion in and all the rest of it. So, look, some of my orchestral composer clients, we're talking 128 gigabyte of RAM. Their templates are over 64. There might be an 80 gigabyte template, and then. I'm speaking to colleagues overseas. They're going, is that all? I'm going, what do you mean? They're going, well, we've got clients with 256 gigabyte of RAM and their templates are probably 180 gig or 200 gigabyte. So they'll load that in at the start of the week, in VEP, for example, and then just switch sessions in and out without having to reload the whole thing. So the template's just sitting there, So it's amazing stuff. And the sound quality that comes out of them is quite amazing for me, especially with the good orchestrators. You'd have to be good to be able to tell the difference. I mean, look, some people can easily spot it. I've listened to some material that, quite a few of the clients have actually knocked out, and I've gone, I can't really hear the difference.
I think the trick is you've got to kind of write to the samples you have.
I was about to say the exact same thing. Yeah.
So if you know your limitations, and you know certain libraries have certain little tricks, or a certain instrument that does a certain thing, it's just knowing all that, because the difference between doing a good mock-up and then actually having a orchestrated piece of music that an orchestra or an ensemble can play, almost like you got to do it twice. Basically.
Yeah. But look, a lot of these composers, they will get the mock-up. They'll get the mock-up signed off, and then they'll bring in a real orchestra to do it.
Yeah. And that causes its own issues, because sometimes then people get used to hearing the mock-ups, which are pretty damn good in their own way, and then you've got to direct an orchestra.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then sometimes layer back some of the mock-up, some of the string shorts or something.
I'm pretty sure that happens quite a bit, where we're actually layering the both, I would suggest. So that's kind of interesting, and because I don't work in that area myself, I don't know what the actual legality, or not the legality, or what the mechanics are, where I think doesn't there have to be a percentage, there has to be a real instrument, depending on whether it's where the film is actually made, or am I kind of way off base here? Because I do know that
for music funding from some arts things, if you're getting funding for your film and post-production, there is musician clause and stuff. More there has
to be an element, So I thought it was more in America, but is it in Europe as well?
It might be in America as well,
Yeah, but it's not so much here in Australia, guys. Do you know?
I've never come across it.
I haven't come across it either.
Right. So I reckon I think it might be more an American thing, because the some of my clients that have worked, and it's been an American film, and I've heard the mock-ups. I'm going, that's brilliant. They've gone, so we're just going to be flying over to some Eastern Bloc country and hiring an orchestra for 3 days. So they fly in and they hand out the sheet music and go tap, 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 and off they go. And the whole thing's re-recorded with a live orchestra. They weren't allowed to use the mock-up.
Yeah. I think I might know at least one of those people that you're talking about. The mutual friend of ours,
Yes, more than likely,
and that's an interesting thing as well. Like, I've had this conversation with musicians in Melbourne. I mean, this is changing a little bit, but it is the VST versus real musician thing. Is that it's quite hard. It devalues the musician when you've got all these libraries and all this capability and sounds and qualities and things you can just pull up, and things like trills and things that are quite, and runs that are quite hard.
Mm-hmm.
And you're throwing this stuff at musicians and expecting them to play it and just get it out in like a couple of takes. Like, I know the MSO have done some incredible stuff. I've sat in some amazing sessions, but you know, it must be incredibly high pressure knowing that people have already heard the first track, you know, the track in their head for the first time. It's not like the old days where there would be that magic moment of the musician hearing it for the first time on an orchestra.
Yeah. Well, do you remember back in the 80s that they were trying to ban synthesizers in America? Do you remember that?
Pretty funny.
That's
just so not 80s though.
I love it.
I've got some old keyboard magazines going back all the way back to, you know, like 1979, 1980, and I've got one with the front cover that was saying, you know, and all the musicians unions were trying to ban synthesizers because they were actually taking real musicians' jobs, and I'm like going, what? I mean, if you could get something that sound, you know, realistic at an orchestral level in the 70s and 80s out of those analog synthesizers, you were doing well. I know. What was it? Switched on Bark. That was what was that composer's name?
Yes, I've got a bunch of those records. Yeah,
and look, my brain's just failed me. But that was quite good, you know, for the time with all the early Moog synthesizers and stuff. But you listen to it back now, you go, that doesn't sound anything like an orchestra. But yes, I do remember those, you know, ban the synthesizers. You know, there was all these protests and stuff, and I think that's when a lot of the unions got involved and said, you know what, you know, you can sit there and record and write your music on synthesizers, but there has to be at least a portion of it being played by real players. So I don't look. That's
I know that there's certain things you just can't get with samples. You know, you might, you know, if you don't have a budget to record an orchestra like a lot of people don't, you know, you might need to use some orchestral samples, but then I know me personally, I end up recording some like players or vocalists or whatever. It just gives it some humanity and some life and something you engage with more. And, you know, like, for example, I've got some great sampled cellos and they're great for mock-ups, but I always record a real cello because you just can't get that sound. There's the way a cello player transitions between notes and their vibrato, because, you know, you can have like kind of virtual vibrato that you can sit there and spend like, I don't know, days trying to program so it sounds real. Or you could just get someone to come in and play it and it's going to sound real because it is real. So there's certain things like that that I don't think you can recreate.
Yeah.
I just don't think you can.
And the good players these days will play for recordings. So they'll understand they have to, you know, play with a slightly different style each time because you're layering. And they'll slightly be out with their intonation and stuff for the next time that they play it. And they'll give you variations. And they'll be, oh, do you want like a slight, you know, variation? And when you tell them, oh, we're doing an overdub, they'll change the way they play.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like because in a way, samples are just kind of like, you know, the availability of them, and there's lots of free things out there as well. It's just opening up that whole world to a lot more people, because now you can get, you know, a laptop or something and get some free sounds and play with them, and then you kind of get an idea of what strings sound like. Maybe you didn't have that kind of opportunity previously, and I think it kind of opens it up. But I think maybe it's actually good for musicians and it's probably good for orchestras because it's opening up those sounds to a lot of people.
Oh, of course.
As they progress, they realize, hang on, if I go and get a real player, I'll get my friend or find someone, you know, online or whatever. And also now session players are kind of setting up their own little studios. So there's, you know, all these online marketplaces where you can engage session players from all over the world and send them your music, send them your backing track and everything, and they'll record it and send it back to you.
Yeah.
So it's all opening up and changing and evolving. And I think in a way samples could be a really positive thing because it's keeping all of that alive as well, and it's exposing more people to it. But I don't know.
Yeah. Well, look, how many people have are introduced to orchestral music from film scores? You know,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, how powerful are the film scores? And that's probably the only really exposure that a lot of people will get to orchestral music. And they don't go to concerts or anything like that. They don't actually listen to classical music, but they'll sit there and be in awe of those huge orchestral scores that are getting pumped out from the movies. So I think it has to be a positive. Look, I think with where the real players come in is actually in the level of expression, and
totally.
as it's got better and better over the years, MIDI is still MIDI. You know, there's 128 steps to, you know, there's not a lot of what's the word? Help me out here, Aaron.
Oh, I can't think of it. My coffee's worn off.
Are we talking about like microtonal, like sort of slides and lands, or we're
talking about the limitation of, say, velocity in MIDI.
Oh, velocity. Sorry, we're talking about the 7-bit. Yeah. Parameter. Yeah. So there are. There's only the sort of granular. Well, it's not granular. It's like a quantized to the nearest value, and of course we slide, and they'll do little interpolations and things as you slide up and down, but. You know, a lot of the time when you're doing things like a ramp down with an orchestra, you know, all the musicians are playing together. And if you're doing something like, you know, a violin, like where you're trilling really quick, you know, and the way they all blend and they go loud and quiet is one musician goes a bit louder and another one goes a bit louder. It's a very complicated shower of sound and dynamics that sort of rolls around. And to have that done with a single control, you know, just drawing it on the screen, you know, where it's all going up together and all coming down together. It's sort of very locked in, and I don't know. And I find it's too instantaneous. Real music has a bit of a lag and a bit of a behind.
And it slides in, and it kind of, you know, movement, and also like natural tuning as well. You know, it's like everyone's kind of adapting to each other, and you know, listening to each other as they play and changing things slightly. It's just this kind of organic, you know, movement and change within all the players together. And, you know, with a sample, it's like a singular kind of snapshot. And also you get, like, with the different velocity level, like layers, you get like some phasing when you kind of crossfading between those. And there's all these little things that happen with samples, which just take away that realness.
So I think actually what the word I was looking for was resolution. We're talking about resolution, right?
So that's the resolution, yep.
So we're talking about the resolution. You know, MIDI, we've got 128 steps currently, you know, for the velocity, where MIDI 2, I can't remember what the exact level is, but it's like through the roof, you know. So I think we're going from, you know, 8-bit to, you know, 32.
For 16 or something. I think it goes up to something like 64,000 or 32,000.
Yeah. So the level of expression that's going to be available with MIDI 2 is going to be quite phenomenal. And I was listening to another podcast today where Pete Brown was again chatting in depth about some of the MIDI 2 spec that's coming. I don't know how smooth it's going to be to roll out, though, to be quite honest. I was picking up some bits and pieces that, just reading in between the lines, that some of the DAW manufacturers are not really jumping on this very, very quickly, because there's going to be some pretty key reprogramming to be done.
And is it cheap is the question. And how much more does it add to the cost of building things? Because MIDI is dirt cheap. I mean, that's why Dave Smith and co made it back in the day. It was all the guys are on all the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's what is it? It's 30 years old. It's more.
And it was pretty crap at the time. Well, it wasn't. It was like pretty like next level. But the other manufacturers who were making the more expensive stuff at the forum time, you know, when they were sitting at NAMM breaking it out in the room, we're all saying, no, we're not having a part of it unless it's got at least, you know, 16 bits of resolution for this and that. And they looked at it and it just went, to build that, it's going to cost, you know, $100 an instrument to add it on. Has to be something simple and cheap. And it was simple-ish and cheap-ish in 1984. So you can imagine how simple and cheap it is to add on a synth now. And in fact, most chipsets have like a library that will just do it out the box. So you can just shove a MIDI like on something for next to nothing, like, 20 cents.
Yeah. But I mean, look, for the MIDI protocol that they wrote in 1980, it was 1984, was it, Chris? I mean, yeah, it was.
It was 83, 84, yeah, when they wrote
84. To have survived and still working now, that has exceeded all expectation. It would have had to,
I know, I love it. I've got a Prophet 600, which was the very first MIDI keyboard, and it still works perfectly. I use it as a controller sometimes.
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
awesome.
No, of course. And I'm trying to remember. I think my first keyboard that had native MIDI was a Juno 106.
I was going to say 106. Yeah.
But I had MIDI on my Jupiter 8 retrofitted. So look, it was pretty amazing back then. But we used to use it to stack sounds initially, and then the sequences started coming in, and then the rest is history. But it is pretty amazing that the MIDI spec has survived this long. And MIDI 2, I'm going to get Pete back on to actually have a little bit more of a chat about that, because he's leading the team at Microsoft in regards to that. And I think some of the keyboard manufacturers are already on board. But yeah, like I said, reading in between the lines from what I was listening to today, I don't think the DAW guys are actually lining up, with the bells on. So I think
interesting.
They're probably just waiting to see who jumps first. That's probably that's my kind of view on it. But look, it'll get there. But that's an interesting one to see how that evolves. Some of the developers were saying, or some of the synth guys were saying, well, the current MIDI works fine, but I'm not really needing any more expression, and like, why should I go?
I wonder what more resolution would do for sample playback when, say, you've got 3 velocity layers, or kind of a max of 5 or something like that.
Yeah,
it's not really going to make much difference, at all.
It will be interesting how it actually evolves, though, because the key synthesizer manufacturers are the guys that are on board, people like Yamaha and Roland, for example. I don't think Korg are just yet. But so they're actually working with it, and they're getting that higher level of resolution and expression out of their instruments, and they're sample based,
and I guess it's the biggest limitation with MIDI is its connector, because of what you can put over the cable, and you max it out pretty easy, and then you've got lags and delay things, and you need MIDI boxes and timing things, and that's one of the big things. It's only like 30 kilobits a second protocol, so to be able to, and it's funny because that MIDI over USB has almost become a standard now.
Yeah.
Where you just have like a hub, and you plug in with a USB, like with these virtual MIDI devices, instead of using the actual MIDI converter, but you still end up as a MIDI signal. It's just over USB.
Yeah.
Which is really weird to think that there's this in between that's kind of come up as a it's still MIDI, but in a same packets, but in a different connector.
Well, isn't it just simply that it's the MIDI interface is just built in directly into the controller, and instead of using your DIN, it's just being connected via the USB.
That's it on the other end,
side of
which
it,
is an interesting way to get around it. But I'm certainly looking forward to being able to daisy chain a bit more stuff together with a standard that's, and I wonder if it's something that's going to be able to be implemented over the old MIDI cables. Like, I wonder if, for instance, you were saying you've got the Octatrack, I've got a Digitact, and I was wondering, like, when we have MIDI 2, are we going to have like some kind of adapter where you can plug in?
Well, I can give you some insight on that one. They're thinking of using Ethernet cables.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Right.
So the connectivity,
you need a box converter, and
the connectivity will be via normal Ethernet Cat 6 or whatever, So that'll be interesting. Well, again, I'm just remembering little snippets of it, of the conversation that I was listening to, and it is evolving. But I don't think there's a massive rush to the gate at the moment, But that will be interesting to see how that evolves.
I was going to say, to bring it back, interestingly, MIDI is one of the things that killed trackers to some degree.
Right.
Because its timing is, you can have such minute timing. You can like suddenly jump in and chuck a whole load of 30-second notes in, and it doesn't quantize. Like it's got that, that MIDI clock is quite quick.
Yep.
And so when you were trying to enter stuff into a track, I mean, you could use it, but because it didn't have the piano roll, which you could sort of unlock and, have stuff drifting all over the place, trackers very lock stuff in. So although, it was good for outputting, you could output over MIDI and all the timing was super tight and everything like that. Like it was coming in and playing, for instance, on a MIDI keyboard and quantizing afterwards and fixing up your mistakes didn't happen as gracefully with a tracker. It was like, stuff kind of landed in its grid and was sometimes out and all over the shot. And I don't think anyone really had a very good experience. Did you ever try MIDI at all, Aaron, with your trackers?
No, I didn't. I just did it in the tracker when I was using it. So yeah, I used trackers for a while, but then I ended up at the same time. My father had an old Atari with a very early version of Cubase, and I used to hook that up to some like Roland sound modules and play with that. So I was kind of playing with both a bit, but I preferred the trackers because I could put in my own samples. And,
well, that was the big thing, yeah.
Yeah, and the Roland sound modules, you still got them actually, and they're not very good sounds in there. They weren't like your JVs or anything like that. So yeah, I just preferred it because I could get a break beat and put it in there and chop it up. And I'll tell you what, I thought Scream Tracker, it just had a certain sound. Like you'd render that to a WAV file and then load up Windows and play it back, and it just sounded really crunchy and fat.
Yeah,
and I always wondered why it just had this sound about it.
Yeah,
and
it
I
does.
always wondered
it's
why.
Resample engine.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
really
it does,
sound.
rather than interpolated sound resampling, it does very squared off resampling, whether it's just holds the sample if you put the note down so it doesn't join the dots and filter it.
Yeah, right.
So you get this kind of like bit crush almost effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is very, very, the Amiga did it too, had this very kind of crunchy aura about it. And the PC was very sharp with the way it did it. The Amiga was interesting because it actually didn't have a locked sample rate. Like each channel, it actually changed its sample rate depending on what the playback was. So rather than being at 44.1 or like, or 48 and, sampling up to that and sort of doing the fills in between, it would actually just change the sample rate for each note it played. And it sort of did a similar thing in Scream Tracker, but then just kind of like held the sample for a little bit longer if it needed to upmix. Did you ever upmix to like 96K and drop it down, or you just went to whatever it did?
I don't even look. I had no idea what even sample rates were back then. I just literally load up DOS, just load it up and just write beats and then render it and then listen back and go, wow, that sounds really cool. Like if I did it in Windows, it sounded really thin and horrible. But if I did it in Scream Tracker, rendered it and then played it, it sounded just really big and just fat, which is, you've just explained why. So you've kind of answered a question I've always had in my mind. And now I'm thinking maybe I should actually try and build an old Windows machine and get Screen Tracker working again just to write beats on, just for that sound, because
it does have the sound. You can use DOSBox. I don't know if you played around with DOSBox at all.
I haven't, no.
It's basically an emulated PC in a program you just run on a PC or Mac or Linux box, and it just and it emulates the sound blasters and various iterations of hardware.
Oh, really?
Quite
Okay.
Accurately, yeah.
I'm going to check that out. That's awesome.
Amazing.
Yeah, DOSBox is really good, and it runs natively, I think, as well. So, and you can change your sample rate. So you can say, I want a sound blaster running at, 20.
Oh, really?
1K or whatever. Yeah, 025 or what is it, 05K, yeah. And it'll actually, you can set that
That's
all up in the
interesting.
system.
Wow,
You
amazing.
still have to write your auto exec and everything.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that we're, we've got modern technologies to try and replicate the shitty sounds of the late 90s.
They weren't
the
shitty,
shitty
They
sound
sounded
cards.
awesome. They
Sorry,
sounded awesome.
Okay, those awesome sound quality, those Sound Blaster
Squared off.
16s.
Yeah, but the actual Sound Blaster 16 out of Windows, it just sounded horrible. I thought, like, it's just very thin. That's just my memories of it.
Well, that's
And
my
then I got
memory
an
of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I got an Akai sampler and just sampled some stuff into that and played it back out of that. I'm like, oh wow, that just sounds like so much better.
Yeah, we just weren't thinking laterally back in the day. It's like the TB303s. I remember being offered a TB303 for $50 when I was buying my Jupiter 8. And I went,
Oh really?
What the hell do I want that thing for? It doesn't even sound like a bass. So of course, there's all these people. There's all these people listening in that I reckon there'll be the face palming going, you idiot. Totally. But I've heard of heaps of stories like that. Going, what the hell's a T? I don't want that. But you want this thing, man? $50. What is it? Oh, it makes bass sounds. Does it sound like a real bass? No, I don't want it. But this was like 86, 87. I was into rock music. And the TB303 hadn't reached
it wasn't
its
really playable
maturity.
Live.
No,
as an instrument either.
No, there wasn't. Like I said, I wasn't thinking outside the box. I was thinking inside the box, and I thought I can't really think of anything to do with that. No, thank you very much. So, like
$50. No, you could have just shoved it in a cupboard and never seen it again, and brushed the dust off, and you would have been legend. We would have made a YouTube video on the guy that bought a TB303 for $50 as a throw-in back in the day, and found it in their cupboard. Oh, that's 10 million views there.
Look, there's a couple of the analog. Good on you. There's a couple of my old analog synths, actually all my analog synths that I've sold that I have remorse for now, unfortunately, but they've all gone to good homes, and
that's the most you can wish for any piece of hardware, really, isn't it? That it goes and gets played and used.
Well, the one that hurt me the most, I think, would be my Jupiter 8, and I know who has that, and it's been lovingly cared for. I sold it over 20 years ago, and I know that's been completely restored, and so I'm very, very happy with that. And my old Korg Monopoly, which was my first mono synth, first synthesizer.
I love those little Monopolies with the little joystick.
Unbelievable little synth, and I still communicate occasionally with the guy that I sold it to in 1989, and I always still refer to it as, how's my Korg Monopoly going?
They've still got it?
Yeah, he's still got it. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's going, yours? I said, it'll always be mine, mate, because I bought it new. And he goes, no, mate, I bought it off you. I went, nah, it's always going to be mine to a degree, you know what I mean? So, so I do have some regret for the old analog, but the TB303 story, I thought I'd throw that one in just so you'd have a bit of a chuckle.
Amazing. Love it. Do you know what my first synth was?
I would say
I've got it next to my desk at all times.
I've got no idea. Erin?
Oh, you don't know the little VL tone?
A VL
pocket
tone?
synthesizer with a calculator built into it.
Oh, boy.
It's like... But you have this mode where you go into the calculator and you can type in whatever the last number is in the calculator actually programs the synth. And then you switch it back across to music mode, and you can make all these kind of variations of sounds on it.
Now, hang on. Were you just playing that live?
Yeah.
Did you just give us a live performance?
Oh, I hit the demo button.
Right.
Classic song on it, but I did hit a few notes, but yeah.
Okay, well, there you go.
The VL, it's a Casio little kid synth, I guess, but I was just very impressed that they were forward enough thinking to have that key, you could program your own sounds on it. So that was me when I was like 3 or 4 years old, that and the Commodore 64.
And you still got it. The original, your first, see, now I'm getting even more remorseful that I sold it.
I just thought I'd rub it in,
Thanks, mate. That's okay.
I don't have my Commodore 64, so...
I'm kind of regretting that I sold my Atari 1040, and I'm regretting I sold my Atari Mega 4 ST, my Mega 4.
Oh, yeah, I regret selling all my Akai samplers.
Yeah.
It's funny.
We're all starting to sound depressed now.
It's funny though, because you get some of these old machines back out and you fire them up, and then you just realize how patient you were back in the day. I think that if anyone's ever tried to sequence with a step sequencer on a single line LED display,
like the old MC500s or something like that.
Yeah, and now you do it and you're like, oh wow, was I really that? Was I really that patient to do that?
Yeah.
You're scrolling through, it's like, oh, wrong note. Then you delete it. You're like, oh, there's no undo.
Hey, try sampling and looping on a Mirage.
Oh yeah, just with that little knob, and you hit those buttons up and down,
and the just the hexadecimal display. It was just, I think two screens, just a little LED. and I somehow used to loop something and, sample and loop it. It was like,
without it clicking or,
yeah.
But
Wow,
that
that
was the thing,
sounds
and-
great. No, it didn't. But, it was the best we had.
But sometimes using those sounds that weren't quite perfect really kind of defined, a bit of a sound about what you were creating.
All of those orchestral hits, that became just a plague in the middle to late 80s. They were off a Fairlight originally, but then they all ended up on the Mirage in Sonic Mirage. And then I had an Emax 1, which was a 12-bit crunchy thing, but it had an analog filter. It was an amazing sounding thing, So there you go. I'm reminiscing again. See, now I'm going to regret that I sold my Emax.
But I mean, those things were big and heavy and expensive, and they had a value at one point where you could see the value was going down, and it was like, well, you got to offload them before they're not worth anything.
Yeah. Oh, look, I had a hard drive in it, and there was a stack of samples. So the person that bought it, they got a killer. I have not seen or heard of it since, but it was a good box. The good old Emax 1. I actually bought it in the US and shipped it back in the late 80s. So
Did you put a big sign on it saying 110 volts, don't plug in?
No, it had mix mode. It had a mix mode power supply.
Hey.
Yeah, mix mode power supply. It's, 110 or 240 straight in,
You see, that was always a big thing with the computer side of things, because not only was the voltage different, but you had NTSC and PAL.
Yeah.
So you couldn't plug it in your TV.
No.
If you were, and it was the same with the, I think even the Ataris had that. I think they're a little bit more flexible because they had the monitor. But that whole NTSC PAL thing meant that software as well ran at different screen resolutions for different computers in some cases. So if you were in America,
I didn't know that.
and you ran like ProTracker, which is my ProTracker program, and you didn't get a fixed version, it would drop off the bottom of the screen and you couldn't get to the bottom of the screen because PAL had more more lines on the TV.
Oh, those were the days.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's really weird. Like, there's all these things that just change regionally massively. And in fact, I guess that's why in America they didn't really have as big a tracker scene, because a lot of the early tracker stuff was all the software programmers are out of Europe. I think maybe their maths and it was a bit more plentiful access to music equipment, in America, whether they didn't have the same access in Europe. So they just kind of made their own software and their own hacks to do stuff. But it was all in PAL. So shipping it out to America, you'd ship your program and it wouldn't work properly. So, and timing differences. If you play back, for instance, some tracks on some systems, on the American variant, they run, 60 hertz, so 6/5 quicker.
Yeah. So isn't all the film frame rate got to do with the power and the hertz and all the rest of that? Is that correct, or am I off?
TV.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so what are the different frame rates? So, 25 and 29 or something, in it? Between the
it's
two
50
countries?
and 60.
Yeah, 50 and 60 hertz, yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then the frame rates of the films was it 25 or
Film's
29?
usually 24. And then
24.
PAL's 25.
Yep.
And then NTSC is 29
There you
something.
go. So
I should know this, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I do
29.97.
remember the 25s and the 29s, yeah, so there you go. So I'm not completely off the trip.
But that actually isn't. It's funny because there's a bit of a hidden thing in this. It's an interesting one you bring up, because we're still being plagued by 24 and 25 and 29.97. Because a lot of people, if you've got a film up until recently, I mean, Netflix is changing this. It's a bit of a revolution. The revolution isn't something people talk about, but if you have a 24 frames a second master and you want to play it back on PAL television, you can't really do 24 frames a second on a 50 hertz display, which is what we get at home, because you drop a frame every twice a second. So you'd get these glitches on every time you move the camera around. So they just, to get it working, they speed it up. So every film you watch that's on a television release is running at 6% or
they've 5%
sped up.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to time stretch all the stems to get it in sync. So all the audio you're listening to
it's all running quick.
Manipulated, yeah. But I think it's better if people shoot a film at 24 and then speed it up to 25, as opposed to the other way around. Some people shoot films at 25, and then when they want to show it in cinema, they got to slow it down to 24. So then everything's actually running slower, but it tends, in my experience, it sounds better when it's sped up as opposed to slowed down, because when you kind of time stretching, you have to add time to it, whereas when you're speeding it up, it's compressing it, so it's a bit less. It's a bit more punchy. It's kind of like when, especially with the score and music, when it's slowed down that from 25 to 24, it just seems to drag a little bit more. It's very subtle, but yeah, that whole thing is still definitely an issue when outputting a film.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
It's crazy. The whole speed thing. Yeah, and it's funny what you say about going from 25 frames a second to 24. Because I've actually done a few films in the last few years. I do DCP mastering as one of my things, and
yeah, right.
And I did one where she was just mortified when she heard her 24 master, and so she came to me after getting it done at one of the biggest places in Melbourne. Was like, "Can you do a 25?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it'll be out of spec, but I can do it." And I gave her this SMPTE 25, and she just carries 2 hard disks and gives them the 25, and unless they complain, she'll just play the 25. And every cinema so far they've given it to plays the 25, even though it's out of spec.
There you go.
So that's really interesting. Yeah. Because I don't know if it's changed more now, but there were only a few cinemas that apparently could play 25. But
because of the license in inverted commas.
Yeah. So that whole 24-25 thing. So,
boy, did I just open a can of worms?
Oh, it's a huge
totally
can of worms. I've actually been on the flip side of that, where I've edited and mixed a film. I've done the fine cut and the mix and master and DCP mastering, and we've gone back where we've kept the audio at 25 and then we've dropped the video track at 24 down, and I've decided frame by frame which frames I'm going to cut out to make it so that the picture still syncs up. And every time in an interview or a still piece of dialogue, if they're not moving or their arms are not, and I can drop a frame, and you can just decide, you get this it's like a vibe. It's like you just fly through the film with the arrow keys, like learning where to drop the frames out, and you just reline up the film so that the entire thing lines up. And if there's cutaway shots, you just cut the entire cutaway shot and then just cut it short or reposition the cutaway. And you go through every shot in the film, and every second you're making a decision where the frame's going to drop.
Yeah.
And so you're not.
And I've done that
not,
for feature documentaries.
That's really interesting. And so you're
and
you're not changing the actual audio at all.
No, just the picture.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome.
And then you can choose if you want to morph, because you can do like morphed frames, or you can do drop frame, or you can do blended frames, and you make a decision for each shot and each thing, how it works and how it looks and how it feels. And and you just go through the entire film.
I reckon that's actually, I'd love to see what that would be like, because I think it's detrimental to be time stretching the audio. And because you've got to use different algorithms on different stems. So for dialogue, obviously, it's different to music. And then sometimes, I had a particular one I was working on, and I tried every kind of algorithm. And, I had piano, which was kind of the feature at the very beginning of the film, and that was the only sound. And all the algorithms basically had all these artifacts because, the nature of piano being so harmonic. And I finally found one that worked quite well. But it's just,
and it's funny because given the choice as an audio person, I was like, we're going to change the picture.
That's so cool. Yeah, I've never heard of that. That's really cool. I think it's a really interesting way of doing it, and the way that you're kind of going through manually and making that call on the vibe and how it feels. I think that's really awesome.
And it's funny because because with the cutaways and things, a lot of the pans we were. And the cutaway shots, we were really getting the tail and the end of this shot, and we were using the whole shot. And so there was this feeling that was almost like the camera person was just about to end the shot. So in the 25 version, it had this weird energy where a lot of the shots were like the full length of the shot. When we went to 24, you were cutting a lot of those frames off either side. So on a lot of the shots in it, it actually felt better at the 24. Yeah. It was weird. So we prefer the 24 cut.
Sync's a funny thing as well. It's because I've sunk a lot of stuff over the years. I've had to sync, shows or, like a segment from scratch and kind of time stretching. And I've had situations where, the audio is recorded at a different frame rate to how it was shot. And so you kind of got to go in and manually sync it. And it's a really interesting thing, sync, because, it's kind of like you never want to be running early. It feels wrong. You can get away with a frame or two later. Maybe it seems a bit kind of loose, but it feels better. And it's just this whole thing, it's like a feel thing. Yeah.
And in a cinema, you're sitting a fair way away anyway, a lot of the time from the
exactly.
picture. So, you're going to be, the speed of sound comes into it. And a lot of it's just coming from that single center speaker as well.
Yep.
Now, I'm gonna open another can of worms for you.
Do it.
There's lots of them.
Yes, but this one is it's on my run list here. And Chris, mastering techno for lo-fi vinyl and cassette was one of my little notes here. So that's something that you do. So we're going to go full circle back to crunch land now. So off you go. So mastering techno for lo-fi vinyl and cassette.
Well, I mean, if you're talking vinyl, it's a similar consideration to the, having a partnership with a cinema. You got to know, your cutting engineer's got to know that you're going to send them something that's going to be, it's going to work for vinyl. Vinyl's a weird one because it's a physical entity, and because it started off as mono and then they added stereo, you can actually physically do things like pinch the stylus and have it so that it'll just jump around.
Right.
If you're not careful with things like phase on your bass. Because of the curve, it uses the RAII like curve. If anyone's ever got a turntable and plugged it into their line-in socket, they'll be like, "Where's all the bass?"
That curve's hardcore, isn't it?
And it's super hardcore. Even if anyone's ever done that and tried to adjust for it in software and gone, I can just plug a turntable in a line in and then adjust for it in Cool Edit. We all did that when we were kids. But it's a hardcore curve.
Yeah.
And that hardcore curve means that the bass, especially, you've got to be quite protective of what your stylus is doing. And you've got to consider the wavelengths that travel along the average vibrations along the cartridge as well. So if you're doing harsh frequencies around that 4 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz thing, and you're chucking out massive square wave, like that can actually damage a cutting head because you're the resonance of the cutting head if you're not careful, and you can actually damage the coils because as it all vibrates. So you've got to kind of understand a little bit about what you're cutting on, and it's a physical entity. And also phasing. Stereo is a big thing with vinyl. You just can't do hard stereo dephased bass.
You can't. Yeah, imagine that. Out of phase sub bass. It's not going to work.
Jump the cartridge and just start bouncing around,
Yeah.
So, you've played around a little bit with this side of things?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I've recently, I think a couple of days ago, a record came out. I mastered 7-inch, and look, I've collected vinyl for years. Obviously coming from jungle drum and bass kind of roots from back in the 90s, and been fascinated with records. I've got quite a few records out as well. And what I like about vinyl, I mean, other than the sound of it and just the kind of the physical aspect of it, is those limitations that you're talking about. It forces you to do a good mix that has a strong low frequency mono signal, and nothing like kind of too harsh and weird, but in a way that mix that you're forced to do actually sounds great on sound systems. And I think that's kind of that's what I like about it. It's kind of it sets this kind of limitation to how you've got to mix it down and kind of mix it down essentially and master it. Which gives it consistency and, means it's going to sound good on a big sound system, which essentially generally sounds good in mono at the end of the day. So, yeah.
And it's about writing your tracks so that they're dynamic as well. If you want a big punchy sound, you control your dynamics in the composition of the song.
Exactly. Yeah,
rather than slamming a compressor on it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and also there's that whole thing of like, there's no point limiting it. And I had this conversation a number of times with people, that have cut a lot of dub plates. Like they still play dub plates, and they're just vinyl junkies, so they won't play CDs or they won't play USBs nowadays. And they'll any track that they can't get that's actually released, they'll get a dub plate cut. And they've cut all sorts of tracks, and they've cut tracks that are hard limited, that are designed really to play in in a digital set. And at the end of the day, there's no point limiting them that hard, because you're not going to get that extra volume with the vinyl cut, because they're just going to have to kind of turn it down to a point. So,
and it'll also recreate those peaks. I mean, if you actually take a hard limited track and then you put it to vinyl, and then you capture that vinyl back on your PC and you have a look at it, there's all these weird peaks that kind of trough and recreate themselves.
Yeah, right. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it is a bit more squished, but it's squished in weird ways with these little pokey out bits that kind of like come and go with that physical motion of the head. And then if you're taking those and then you're getting a club limiter hit them again, it just starts to sound a bit strange. And it's almost like the limiter, that's where it starts ducking out stuff and sounding a bit weird. Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is, if there's I find that it's good for if you want to do something like a massive build-up and you want that build-up to actually like then kick in when it kicks in. I often limit as they build up. I'll put a hard limiter on that, and then when it kicks in, I'll just pull the limiter off again. Because I find that works really well. And then what the cutting head does is actually it does something crazy with that build-up, but it still gives it those peaks. And then when you unleash it, yeah, it's a good way of making it so it still has that kick, because the physical motion, you've just got to let that head like remove again. And that's a trick I found that's handy.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because to be honest, like this record is the first thing I've mastered. I mean, I'm not a mastering engineer really. I've only just started doing a bit of mastering for some friends and stuff like that. But yeah, interestingly, it's the first one that's gone to vinyl. And I did a fair bit of research, but I didn't get into that kind of level of things. It was more about trying to find the kind of the balance between how far to push it, how hard to limit it, without kind of finding that sweet spot. And I did quite a bit of experimentation and tests and stuff like that. And I think I found a good place for it.
Did they give you a test pressing as well as part of it?
No, I didn't get. Actually, I think the label got the test press, but I didn't hear it. No, but they were happy with it. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. It's kind of like known as etiquette, that the sound engineer should always be given the test. I've been done stuff for France where they've, in fact, all the ones I've cut have been for this French label, and they've always sent me a test pressing, and they make sure it arrives express and that I've heard it before they release it. It's like it's this etiquette thing.
Right.
Maybe it's more a European etiquette. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I'm not really sure how the whole thing worked, but it sounds good. I haven't got my copy yet. I'll be getting my copy soon. It's a local label. They do kind of dub techno, that kind of stuff.
So those releases that you guys are mastering for vinyl, are they being released in different digital mediums as well? And if so, is it a completely different master that's going to the digital format?
My answer is no.
My answer is no as well.
Yeah.
It was the same master, yeah.
It's the same. Yeah. So hang on. But is it going to a digital format at all or not?
Yes.
Mine it's played off the record as its digital master.
Ah, right. Okay.
Yeah, they got a Project One and a nice cart that was worn in, and they just played it out.
That's cool.
So
that's flack.
So Erin, you're saying that the one that you're mastered, you've actually released it as a digital format
actually,
as well.
I don't know if this one is coming out digital. Actually, I think it might be vinyl only, this particular one. But I know from what I know is that generally the digital master is also the master that gets cut.
Right.
And I thought they would be two different things, but I don't think they are. And I guess it depends on the genre and the style of music. But
yeah. Well,
I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listening in again from what Chris has blown my mind here. I didn't even have any concept of that there was that much involved to actually master something for vinyl as opposed to different medium.
Yeah, it's a physical. I mean, digital is amazing. That's when it came out. Everyone was just like gobsmacked because it was like, oh, you can do all this stuff.
Okay.
Even with tape, it compresses it.
So now, but now you're motivating me because I've got a turntable I haven't used in 20 years, but it's been sitting collecting dust in a shed. So I think I might piff that one and get a half decent one. But I've got a stack of vinyl here from when I grew up. A lot of those bands, classic albums from 70s and 80s. And and I've got them all on digital formats as well. I've got them all on CD and of course MP3 as well. But the thing is, my ear is now so trained to listen to it in a digital format. I'd probably freak out listening to that stuff on vinyl. Like that early Pink Floyd stuff. And
you love it, I reckon.
Yeah, I've got to get myself a turntable again, I think.
Yeah, I wouldn't discredit your old one. I mean, is it what era is it? The 80s or?
It would be early 90s.
Because you're going to be struggling for less than $1,000. There's nothing cheap that sounds that good.
So it looks like I'm dusting off the old one and finding a new style.
Yeah, just a new card on it. Chuck a new band on it. I redid a band on my home Sansui the other day.
I'm not sure what. Look, it wasn't like a cheap throwaway, but it wasn't a really high end one either. I can't remember. It was in the 90s, and I this would have been probably the last time I put a needle on a piece of vinyl would have been about 93, 94. I know that's horrific for some people to hear, but that was the last time I did it. And I remember I was sitting in my little flat, and I put Pink Floyd on after a jazz cigarette and just went, wow! I just melted into it. It was amazing. Wish You Were Here. It was. I even remember the album.
Yep. With the Hands on Fire.
Yeah, I mean,
pressing of that.
Wish You Were Here on vinyl was pretty amazing. And I've still got all of that Dark Side of the Moon, and there's a whole stack of stuff from that genre, that era.
There's something special about it. And it's funny because we are tuned differently. Like listening to a record flat's a little bit of an interesting thing. I find that I'm always cranking up about 8 dB of bass.
The big button. I call it the big sine curve. The big bass and the no mid, and then up around 6.
I have my bass knob permanently fully to the right on my DJ mixer.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm usually at +7, +8. Yeah, for the old stuff.
This is as far as it goes, basically.
Yeah. And the newer you get, the more bass they sort of like slowly introduce. You're like, whoa, you're ducking it back. Yeah. But I mean, of course, that's the difference between 45s and 33s. And, you get a lot more punch and a lot more volume out of a 45 than you do a 33. It depends if they're trying to get the full, 26 minutes, 27 minutes on the side, it gets a bit thinly cut as well.
Yeah. I'm quite fascinated, just going back to what you were talking about with how you limited the build up, and then like those little tricks with cutting vinyl. I reckon that's really interesting stuff. So is there kind of have you done quite a bit of this?
A little bit. I've done maybe 10 releases. Mostly singles. Awesome. And one album of other people's stuff, and one of some of my tracks. That little trick was one. I guess the whole bass, making sure everything's sort of under 300 or 200 hertz is kind of a big one.
Yeah.
You try to get that on composition if you can, and make sure that anything, if you're getting it on composition, try to make sure that everything that's running a bit higher, if it is pans, to sort of roll off a little bit, sort of, down to 80 or down. But I mean, it's, you write a little bit differently, I guess, for record. But and then what I'm trying to think, there's other tricks. In terms of EQ, you don't get too jiggy on the treble. You know, it's always better to have a bit of a duller mix, especially those higher frequencies around that sort of 4, 5, 6K. You know, they get a little bit harsh sometimes.
You get that
especially
weird
crash cymbals.
Yeah. That kind of weird stereo distorted sound you get with vinyl sometimes on those sibilants. Where it's just
it is exactly that. It's like you need a de-esser on it to so you do get a little bit of that, and that's again depending on the cutting head and like, you know, the movement of the cutting head, and the mastering engineers will take care of a lot of this as well. The vinyl engineers, so they will actually tweak your mix again as it's being cut. So this is why when you get it cut to different records, you'll get different like plates back, and sometimes they'll, like with your test cut, they'll, depending what it is, sometimes they have multiple cutting heads, and they'll use the other system, the other machine, to cut the second one if you reject it. So you will actually get different cuts, different sounding cuts, and it's to do with the physical medium and how it moves, and even the impedance of the cutting heads, you know, things that throw the cutting head around. There's so many variables in getting it to the physical world that it travels along. And you've got an engineer the whole time listening in and looking down a microscope, and depending on the temperature of the room and things like that, it'll change how hard the shellac or the master thing they're cutting into is. So, different days and different setups, and the life of the head, where you are in the life of the head, is gonna change. And then when you press, obviously it's how many masters in or how many copies in. When you get your test pressing, you're getting a first stamp or a second or a third stamp. If you're doing a run of 1,000, you might buy the 1,000th copy. You get in the bottom of the box, or is it the top of the box? I think the top box is your later pressings. So it's always interesting to do your later pressing, your earlier. They don't always tell you which is which.
Sorry, I was just about to ask because I'm intrigued. With what you've just said, once you move it into mass production, how is that actually going to be translating? And you've just answered it for me that. So you've got your master. By the time you get to your 1,000 pressing, you're going to have a different result.
So you have more what you call it, because you have your stamp, your master, and then you have your stamper, which is the inverted of that.
Yep.
So they'll do multiple stampers off your master, and sometimes after a while they'll cut another master as well. You have to go a fair way down for that to happen. But yeah, so you with all your whole electroplating stuff and creating the stamper, you end up with a few stampers the more you're creating. So, and it's up to the machine operator, and how lazy they're feeling and what the order is and what if it is a hi-fi pressing or a run of the mill, and if who the client is. If it's some indie thing, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, just keep pressing it. They do quality check it as well on the fly a little bit.
Yeah, there's this new program that's just been released, I think, and I can't remember the name of it. I might give it to Vin for the notes or something. But basically it's this, I think they're a German company. They've created this software where it actually emulates a vinyl cut digitally.
Wow.
Okay. And they designed it for cutting HD vinyl or something. There's this certain type of vinyl they cut, but now they've released it as something that mastering engineers can get, and you basically run it on your computer, and it actually emulates cutting the vinyl with grooves, and you can kind of test and do it all virtually, and then that you can actually get that and then use that to press these special vinyl things that they use, but you can also use it to test how your record will cut. So it's really, really interesting development. I followed them earlier in the year when I was looking into all this stuff, and they hadn't actually released it yet, but I did get an email about it. I can't remember when, a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, that they've actually released it. It's not cheap, but it looks really, really interesting if you're cutting vinyl, because you could do those things that you're testing, or you could try different tricks. You could actually throw things at this thing and see how it would actually react if it was being cut. But I can't remember the name of it.
That is a big thing, Even doing something like a flanger, is it'll change the way, because it does really strange little movements on the and you lose some of the binaural effect, and you sort of get like a third phantom sound.
Yeah,
that's wild. So it sounds like it's actually emulating.
It is.
The full,
it's crazy.
Needle and the full transfer process and surface noise and all of
that. Yeah, and like the grooves and just how they
physics.
It looks crazy. Like it's a crazy piece of software.
And it's one of those niche things where it's always like you only cut a few vinyls, but it's like you really want it and you want to support it. It's like, if it's less than a couple $100, I might get one.
It's not less than a couple $100. But like I just thought of it then because when you're talking about that trick with the build up and just like something like that would actually allow you to sit there and play around with different things without actually having to cut anything.
Into talk. Yeah. But of course, you've also got to consider what you're playing it back on, and that's the flip side of it. I guess they would have a panel as well where you could choose what you're listening to it on, and because if you're, using a hi-fi cart versus, some of the kids, I don't think they really understand the concept of a record player. You see these JB Hi-Fi, that $100 record players with amps built in kind of thing, and they sound absolutely woeful. versus just getting a nice secondhand deck with a good cartridge and lubing it up and, putting a new band on it and getting it calibrated and sounding good. Like, that's, to me, is what a turntable is. And I guess part of the charm is that, your deck is going to sound, different to other people's decks. It's got its own charm to it, its own sound. And that's the sound that you get used to, especially if you've got a Class A amp with it as well. That's a whole other kettle of fish. But, you get used to how your setup sounds and how, like, what you like to hear. And then you get the surface noise, the rumble and things like that as well.
It's all part of it, I reckon. Yeah.
Yeah, and it stops it being as pure and sort of gives you, breaks up the sound a little bit for your ears, especially for electronic, which is usually really repetitive. And digital electronic music, I always struggled to listen to it because there was a certain amount of wow and flutter and, and variance with a turntable, especially I've got a lot of hard house.
Yeah.
And even though those tracks were quite, repetitive, there was a certain amount of variance that you got from having it on vinyl. And when you drop it into a digital domain, it just gets boring, if that's the right word. Like,
because you just get
like cycle correct.
There's digital black there. There's no sound. So it's like that whole idea of putting back noise or that surface noise. You know what I mean?
And the loop, the fact that it's just locked. So what you're listening to is like phase correct.
Yeah.
Every it might even be like for a techno track, it might be for every 2 seconds, you've just got something that's sitting and then slowly building. And in digital, that sort of sounds a lot different to when you're in an analog domain.
Totally.
Yeah. Hey, the other part of that question was cassette, but I'm not sure we've really got time to go down that rabbit
are pretty boring compared to vinyl. They've got a bit of hiss, a bit of wow and flutter, and the variance of quality of playback's even more. But there's not really anything limiting on cassette, just a lower bass, cut under 20, 25 kind of thing.
So you actually are adjusting your master that for going to cassette.
There's no point recording stuff that's not going to go to tape. You may as well listen to what it's going to sound like. But a mistake that a lot of people make is go, there's no bass on tape and cutting at 40. Like a good cutting, like a good duplication place will actually go down low. So.
Right. Okay. Hey, guys, I've got a feeling that you two are hitting your second wind while I'm kind of sitting there slowly melting in my chair here. But you guys are the night owls, where I'm the guy that's usually up at 5:30, 6 a.m. And so I'm kind of starting to teeter at the moment. Look, guys, this has been a fantastic show. I think we've covered a very wide and varied area where we started off with the whole chip music area, and now we've ended up in vinyl mastering.
But everything we've talked about tonight has been the nuance of sound,
of course,
and that little tiny subtle difference that might not be perfection, but is something in music something in sound quality that we admire. Yeah. And it's funny that in a DAW world, we're talking about the stuff that isn't perfect, which we actually think makes the finishing piece of the audio.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah,
that's
no,
it.
Of course. Well, guys, I think we should give it a bit of a wrap up now. So thank you very, very much for your time and energy this evening. It's been fantastic, and I think for once I almost couldn't get a word in edgewise. So, and I actually look. I actually quite enjoyed sitting back and just listening to you guys rap on about all of those areas, because this is why I teamed you two guys up, because I know you had a lot in common, and it's been quite enlightening for me listening in, and I think that we should end it now, and you guys are more than welcome to come back again, and you can continue on, put a pin in it wherever we've left it right now, and continue on. I think another subject matter that we didn't cover tonight, but myself and Erin were discussing earlier this week, that is going to be an area that is developing, which is the Atmos mixing area. And
meta mix.
That's something that I think we are going to cover that in a different show, I think. So I think
that's a good idea, Vin.
Yeah, I think so. All right. So guys, again, thank you very, very much. And if you guys want to quickly sign off, that'll be awesome. Shoot, Erin.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks for having me, and great to chat, Chris. And yeah, catch up next time.
Absolutely, Erin. And great sitting having a chat. Hopefully at some point when restrictions ease a bit, we can grab a beer and, flesh some of this stuff out. It sounds good.
Yeah, would love to. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah,
awesome, guys. Thank you again. And all right, guys, thank you for everyone that's actually listened in. And on to the next.